Poor maid marries a 61-year-old millionaire. Days later, a hidden room reveals his true past. What would you do if the man you trusted, the man who changed your life, turned out to be hiding a secret so big it could bring down the most powerful people in the country? This is the story of a young maid, a reclusive millionaire, and a web of lies that unraveled to reveal truths no one was prepared for. Stay with me, because every step of this journey will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. In the quiet heart of the English countryside, nestled among rolling green hills and flower-lined cobblestone streets, lay the quaint village of Fairhaven. Its charm was undeniable, a place where time seemed to slow, and the air carried the scent of lavender and fresh bread from the local bakery. Among its residents lived a young woman named Eliza, whose life, though modest, radiated an uncommon beauty. Eliza had been a maid at the Grand Whitmore estate since her teenage years, working tirelessly to support herself and her younger brother Thomas. Left orphaned at a young age, Eliza's determination to provide for Thomas while maintaining her gentle spirit had earned her quiet admiration from the villagers. She was known for her kindness, her bright hazel eyes, and the faint hum of song she carried while working. The Whitmore estate, where Eliza spent most of her days, was a sprawling mansion of gleaming windows, ornate furnishings, and manicured gardens. Lord and Lady Whitmore were courteous employers, but their world of grandeur felt galaxies away from Eliza's humble existence. She often found herself gazing at the opulent chandeliers or the polished marble floors, wondering what it might feel like to live in such a world. It was on a particularly warm summer evening that a curious conversation reached Eliza's ears. While tidying the grand dining hall, she overheard Lord Whitmore speaking to a guest. "An extraordinary man, though he keeps to himself," Lord Whitmore said. "Charles Thorne, the newest resident of our village. They say he's amassed a fortune beyond imagination, yet he lives alone, tucked away in that sprawling estate near the edge of town." Eliza paused. The name was unfamiliar. She imagined the man a stern and brooding figure, likely surrounded by the trappings of wealth, with little care for the world outside his gates. As days passed, rumors of Mr. Thorne spread like wildfire through Fairhaven. Some whispered that he was a reclusive widower, others that his wealth came from ventures abroad. Eliza, though intrigued, had little time for gossip. Her days were consumed with chores, and her evenings spent teaching Thomas his lessons by candlelight. But fate, ever the mischievous weaver of destinies, had plans for Eliza and Mr. Thorne. One bright afternoon, while returning from the market with her arms full of fresh produce, Eliza noticed an elderly man struggling to lift a heavy trunk near the village square. His silver hair gleamed in the sunlight, and his finely tailored clothes, though simple, hinted at his wealth. Recognizing him from whispers in the village, she realized it was none other than Mr. Thorne himself. "Let me help you with that, sir," Eliza said, setting her basket down and offering a warm smile. "Mr. Thorne looked at her, startled at first, before his expression softened. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with fatigue. "It's not often one finds kindness so freely offered." With a small grunt, Eliza hoisted the trunk with ease, carrying it alongside him toward his carriage. As they walked, the two fell into an easy conversation. To her surprise, Mr. Thorne was neither stern nor brooding, but kind, with a gentle wit that made her laugh despite herself. He spoke of his love for the village, his solitary life, and the peace he sought in Fairhaven. When they reached his estate, a sprawling ivy-covered manor hidden behind a wrought-iron gate, Mr. Thorne turned to her. "You have a rare gift, Miss Eliza," she offered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Eliza Bennet." "Eliza," he repeated, smiling. "I hope we meet again." As Eliza walked away, her heart lighter than it had been in months, she couldn't help but feel that their meeting was the start of something she couldn't yet name. Little did she know, her life was about to change in ways even she could not imagine. The weeks that followed her chance meeting with Mr. Thorne were marked by a curious shift in Eliza's routine. Though she remained steadfast in her duties at the Whitmore estate, her thoughts often wandered back to the quiet, dignified man she had helped that afternoon. Something about him lingered in her mind, his gratitude, his calm demeanor, and the faint sadness in his eyes. It wasn't long before their paths crossed again. One afternoon, while tending to the vibrant roses in the Whitmore garden, Eliza noticed a figure approaching. Dressed in a simple yet elegant coat, Mr. Thorne stood at the garden gate, observing her with a soft smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Bennet," he greeted, his voice warm. Eliza rose from her crouched position, brushing dirt from her hands. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne. What brings you to the estate?" "I was delivering a letter to Lord Whitmore," he explained. "But I must admit, I saw the gardens from the road and couldn't resist coming closer. They are as exquisite as I've heard." Eliza's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, sir. I've tended to these flowers since I started working here." "Your care shows," he said, stepping closer. "May I?" He gestured to the garden, and Eliza nodded, guiding him through the rows of blooming roses, daisies, and lavender. As they walked, their conversation flowed effortlessly. Mr. Thorne asked about her work, her life in the village, and her interests, listening intently to her every word. Eliza found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone before. She spoke of her late parents, her dreams for her younger brother, and the simple joys she found in her modest life. "What about you, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. "You've lived in Fairhaven for months now, yet few know much about you." He chuckled softly, his hands clasped behind his back. "I suppose I prefer it that way. My life has been complicated, Miss Bennet. Coming here was my attempt at finding peace." Eliza hesitated, sensing the weight of his words. "Fairhaven is a good place for that," she said gently. "The people here are kind, and the countryside has a way of soothing even the heaviest of hearts." He smiled at her, the lines around his eyes softening. "I'm beginning to believe that's true." From that day onward, Mr. Thorne became a regular visitor to the Whitmore Gardens. Though their interactions began as chance encounters, they soon became something more deliberate. On days when Eliza worked in the garden, he would arrive with a book, sitting on a nearby bench while she tended to the flowers. They spoke of everything and nothing: books, music, the weather, and the quirks of village life. Despite the whispers that circulated in the village about their growing friendship, Eliza paid them no mind. Mr. Thorne, for all his wealth and stature, treated her with a kindness and respect she hadn't often experienced. In his company she felt seen, not as a maid but as herself. One crisp autumn evening, Mr. Thorne invited Eliza for a walk along the river bank. The air was cool, the leaves crunching beneath their feet as they strolled in comfortable silence. Eventually he stopped, gazing out at the gentle ripples of the water. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice unusually serious, "I must thank you. Since meeting you, I've found a happiness I thought was beyond my reach. Your kindness and resilience remind me of the beauty that still exists in this world." Eliza felt her heart flutter, his words stirring something deep within her. "You give me too much credit, sir," she said softly. "I'm simply doing what anyone would." He turned to her, his eyes filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "No, Eliza, what you do, the way you see the world, it's rare. You've reminded me of what it means to truly live." For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the river filling the space between them. Eliza didn't know what to say, overwhelmed by the weight of his words and the unfamiliar emotions they stirred in her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mr. Thorne offered her his arm. "Shall we?" he asked with a gentle smile. Eliza nodded, slipping her arm through his. As they walked back toward the village, her thoughts swirled with questions she wasn't ready to answer. What did she feel for this man who had so unexpectedly entered her life? And what might this growing bond mean for a woman like her? Unbeknownst to her, the answers would come in time, along with revelations that would change everything she thought she knew about him and herself. The chill of autumn deepened, painting Fairhaven's countryside in hues of gold and crimson. For Eliza, the season brought with it a peculiar warmth, one she felt during her moments with Mr. Thorne. Their walks had become more frequent, their conversations longer, and the quiet companionship they shared now felt as natural as the turning of the leaves. Yet, despite the growing bond between them, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thorne carried a shadow, with him a secret he guarded as closely as the coat he wrapped around himself on colder days. One afternoon, Eliza found herself at the market, selecting apples for a pie she planned to bake for her brother. The square was alive with chatter, and as she reached for a particularly ripe apple, she caught snippets of a conversation between two villagers nearby. "I heard he's hiding something," one woman whispered, her tone conspiratorial. "A man of such wealth, living alone in that great estate. It doesn't add up." "Oh, there's always talk about people like him," the other replied dismissively. "Maybe he's just tired of society. Can't blame him for wanting peace." Eliza's heart sank. She knew they were speaking of Mr. Thorne. Though the villagers' curiosity about him was nothing new, the suggestion of hidden motives unsettled her. She shook her head, scolding herself for letting gossip cloud her thoughts. Mr. Thorne had shown her nothing but kindness. Whatever secrets he kept were his own, and she had no right to pry. That evening, as the first tendrils of fog crept through the village, Mr. Thorne arrived at the Whitmore estate. Eliza had been trimming the hedges near the garden's entrance when she saw him approaching. His usual air of calm seemed faintly disrupted, his gaze distant. "Eliza," he greeted, his voice soft but strained. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," she replied, setting down her shears. "You seem troubled." He hesitated, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "May I walk with you?" She nodded, falling into step beside him. They strolled in silence for a while, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet the only sound. Finally, he spoke. "There are times," he began, his voice low, "when one's past feels like an anchor. No matter how far you think you've traveled, it finds a way to weigh you down." Eliza glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "Are you speaking of yourself?" He offered her a faint smile. "Perhaps, or perhaps it's just the musings of an old man." "You're hardly old," she replied, hoping to lighten the mood. "And if you carry burdens, you needn't do so alone. I've found that sharing even the heaviest weight makes it more bearable." He stopped walking and turned to face her. For a moment he looked as though he might say something important, but then he shook his head. "You're remarkable, Eliza," he said instead. "The way you see the world, your kindness, it's a rare gift. I only hope that you won't think less of me if one day I disappoint you." His words struck her like a sudden gust of wind, leaving her momentarily breathless. "I can't imagine that," she said softly. "Not for a man like you." He smiled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're too generous." Before she could respond, he gestured toward the garden gate. "I should let you get back to your work. Thank you for indulging an old man's melancholy." As he walked away, Eliza watched him go, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. What burdens did he carry, and why did he fear her judgment? That night, as she sat by the fire reading to Thomas, her mind wandered back to their conversation. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Mr. Thorne's past held something more than simple sorrow, that there was a mystery yet to be uncovered. In the days that followed, Mr. Thorne's visits grew less frequent. When Eliza did see him, he seemed preoccupied, his usual warmth replaced with an air of distraction. The change troubled her, but she respected his distance, hoping he would confide in her when he was ready. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the Whitmore parlour, Eliza noticed a folded note on the table. It was addressed to Lord Whitmore, the handwriting bold and elegant. Though she had no intention of prying, the signature at the bottom caught her eye. C. Thorne. The letter lay temptingly within reach, but Eliza resisted the urge to examine it further. Still, the sight of it stirred her curiosity. She wondered if Lord Whitmore knew something of Mr. Thorne's past, something that might explain his recent behaviour. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza took a walk to clear her mind. She found herself wandering toward the edge of the village, where Mr. Thorne's estate loomed in the distance. The ivy-covered manor stood shrouded in twilight, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Eliza hesitated at the gate, wondering if she should turn back, when the sound of raised voices drifted from within. Her heart quickened. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, an argument. One voice was Mr. Thorne's, the other unfamiliar. Eliza took a step closer, straining to hear, but the voices stopped abruptly. Moments later, the front door opened, and a figure emerged, a tall man in a black coat, his face obscured by the fading light. Eliza stepped back, ducking behind the gate as the man strode past her, his pace brisk. Once he disappeared down the road, she turned her attention back to the manor. The stillness that followed was almost eerie. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her breath visible in the cool evening air. Something told her that whatever had transpired in that house was only the beginning. And as she turned to leave, the unease in her chest grew, whispering that the answers she sought would not come without consequences. The days passed with a strange sense of unease hanging over Eliza. Though she continued her work at the Whitmore estate, and her evenings with Thomas were filled with warmth, the mystery surrounding Mr. Thorne weighed heavily on her mind. Who was the man who had left his estate so abruptly that evening? And why had Mr. Thorne been arguing with him? Her questions remained unanswered as Mr. Thorne's visits to the Whitmore Gardens ceased entirely. The absence of his steady presence felt like a missing piece in her daily life, and Eliza found herself longing for the simple conversations that had brought her so much joy. One rainy afternoon, while Eliza was returning from the market, she spotted Mr. Thorne in the distance. He was walking along the edge of the village, his coat pulled tightly around him, head bowed against the wind. On impulse, she quickened her pace, calling out to him, "Mr. Thorne." He stopped, turning slowly. When their eyes met, she noticed the weariness etched into his features. He looked older than she remembered, his usual composure replaced with something closer to despair. "Eliza," he greeted her, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "What are you doing out in this weather?" "I could ask you the same," she replied, stepping closer. "I haven't seen you in weeks. Is everything all right?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away. "There's no need to worry about me. I've simply been preoccupied." Preoccupied. The word felt hollow, a weak attempt at deflection. Eliza frowned, her concern growing. "If there's something troubling you, I'd like to help. You've always been kind to me. It's only fair I do the same." For a moment, he seemed on the verge of confiding in her. But then he sighed, shaking his head. "Some burdens aren't meant to be shared, Eliza. Please, take care of yourself." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the rain, her basket heavy in her hands and her heart heavier still. That night, as she lay in bed, Eliza's thoughts refused to settle. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Thorne's haunted expression, or the sense that he was carrying a weight too great to bear alone. She resolved to visit his estate the next day, determined to offer her help whether he wanted it or not. The following afternoon, under a grey sky threatening more rain, Eliza made her way to Mr. Thorne's manor. The iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The house loomed before her, its windows dark, its ivy-covered walls casting long shadows. She knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound reverberating through the quiet. For a moment, there was no response. Then, to her relief, the door creaked open, revealing Mr. Thorne. His surprise at seeing her was evident, but he quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Eliza," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "This is an unexpected visit." "I had to see you," she admitted, her voice firm. "You've been avoiding me, and I can't stand to see you like this. Whatever is troubling you, I want to help." He sighed, closing the door behind her. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." The entryway was grand, but dimly lit, the air thick with a sense of abandonment. Mr. Thorne led her to a sitting room where a fire crackled weakly in the hearth. As she settled into a worn armchair, he poured tea, his movements slow and deliberate. For a while they spoke of mundane things, the weather, the village, her work. But Eliza could see the strain in his eyes, the effort it took for him to maintain the facade. Finally, she set her cup down and looked at him directly. "Mr. Thorne, I know you don't want to talk about it, but I can see that something is eating away at you. You once told me I reminded you of the beauty in the world. Let me remind you again, you don't have to face this alone." Her words seemed to break something in him. He exhaled deeply, his hands trembling slightly as he set his own cup aside. "There's something you should know," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about me that I've kept hidden for years." Before he could continue, a loud knock echoed through the house, startling them both. Mr. Thorne rose quickly, his expression tense. "Wait here," he instructed, before hurrying to the door. Eliza listened as muffled voices drifted from the entryway. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was urgent, bordering on confrontational. After several minutes, the door closed and Mr. Thorne returned, his face pale. "I must ask you to leave," he said abruptly, his tone firm. "It isn't safe for you to be here right now." "What do you mean?" she asked, alarmed. "Who was that?" "Please, Eliza," he said, his voice softening. "Trust me. Go home." Though reluctant, Eliza nodded, sensing the seriousness in his tone. She rose to leave, but as she passed the study, something caught her eye, a faint sliver of light peeking out from behind a partially open bookshelf. Curiosity tugged at her, and she hesitated, glancing back at Mr. Thorne, who was distracted. When she was sure he wasn't watching, she reached out and pushed the bookshelf slightly. It swung open to reveal a hidden room. Inside, documents and photographs covered the walls, alongside newspaper clippings and a map with pins marking locations she didn't recognize. At the center of it all was a name written in bold letters, Edward Whitmore. Eliza's heart pounded. Edward Whitmore. The name was familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. She turned, her gaze meeting Mr. Thorne's as he stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "So," she whispered, her voice trembling, "who are you, really?" The room seemed to close in around Eliza as Mr. Thorne, "No." Edward Whitmore stepped into the hidden space. His face, which she had always known as calm and composed, now bore the weight of an unspoken truth. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the tension hanging thick in the air. "Eliza," he said finally, his voice low and measured, "I never wanted you to find out this way." She crossed her arms, her heart still pounding. "Then how were you planning to tell me? Or were you hoping I'd never know?" His expression softened, and he gestured for her to sit on a small bench tucked into the corner of the room. When she didn't move, he sighed and leaned against the desk, cluttered with papers. "I owe you an explanation," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor. "My name is Edward Whitmore. Years ago I was a man of considerable influence, a philanthropist, a businessman, a figure often praised and sometimes envied. But that life, it became unbearable." Eliza's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of his confession. She had heard whispers of Edward Whitmore before, a man celebrated for his fortune and charitable work, who had seemingly vanished years ago. But she had never imagined that the reclusive Mr. Thorne could be the same person. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steadier now. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with regret. "I was surrounded by people who valued me only for my wealth, not for who I was. My every move was scrutinized, my every decision questioned. And when my wife, my anchor, passed away, I found myself utterly alone. I made a choice to leave it all behind, to escape the trappings of that world and start anew." Eliza's heart ached at the pain in his words, but she couldn't ignore the questions swirling in her mind. "So you faked your death?" He nodded slowly. "It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only way I could truly be free." I left behind everything, my name, my fortune, my past, and created a new life for myself here in Fairhaven. Charles Thorne became the man I needed to be." She frowned, her hands clenched into fists. "And you never thought about the people who cared for you? Those you left behind?" Edward's shoulders sagged. "I thought about them every day, but the man they knew no longer existed. I was a shadow of myself, Eliza. Staying would have only brought them pain." The room fell silent as Eliza processed his words. Part of her wanted to understand, to believe that his intentions were noble. But another part of her, one that valued trust and honesty above all else, felt betrayed. "So why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice quieter. "Because I can't keep lying to you," he said, his tone earnest. "You've brought light into my life in a way I never thought possible, and if we're to have any kind of future, I need you to know the truth." Eliza's breath hitched at his words. A future. Did he mean that? Could she envision one with a man who had hidden so much of himself? Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Edward's face darkened and he straightened, his posture tense. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm. "Don't move." He left the room, closing the hidden door behind him. Eliza's curiosity flared, but this time she fought the urge to follow. Instead, she glanced around the space, her eyes falling on a photograph pinned to the wall. It showed Edward in a younger, happier time, standing beside a woman with a radiant smile. His late wife, she realized. Moments later, the sound of raised voices reached her ears. Edward was arguing with someone again, his tone sharp and defensive. The other voice, deep and unfamiliar, seemed equally agitated. Eliza strained to hear, but the thick walls muffled their words. Then, suddenly, the voices stopped, and the front door slammed. Edward returned a moment later, his face pale and drawn. "Who was that?" Eliza asked, standing. "No one you need to worry about," he replied quickly, avoiding her gaze. She stepped closer, refusing to let him brush her off. "Edward, you can't ask for my trust while keeping secrets. Who was it?" He hesitated, then sighed heavily. "Someone from my past, someone who knows who I really am." Her stomach tightened. "Are you in danger?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But if they've found me here, it's possible others will too." Eliza's mind reeled. The man she had come to care for was far more complicated than she had imagined, his life tangled in a web of secrets and risks she was only beginning to understand. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward met her gaze, his expression both determined and vulnerable. "I don't know yet, but I do know this. I won't run again. I've spent too much of my life hiding, and I refuse to live that way any longer." Her heart ached at the weight of his words, but she couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at her. "And what about me? What about us?" He stepped closer, his hands trembling as they reached for hers. "That's the only thing I'm certain of, Eliza. Whatever happens, I don't want to face it alone." She searched his face, seeing the man behind the secrets, the pain, the hope, and the love he had tried to bury. And though doubt lingered in her heart, she found herself nodding. "Then we'll face it together," she said softly. Edward's grip tightened on her hands, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Eliza, for everything." In that moment, Eliza realized that their story was only beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also knew that, somehow, they would find their way together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Eliza. Edward missed her. Thorne, as she still found herself calling him at times, had revealed truths that left her reeling. Yet his vulnerability, his willingness to finally be honest with her, had softened the sting of betrayal. Still, the lingering question of the mysterious visitor gnawed at her. One chilly morning, as Eliza was finishing her chores at the Whitmore estate, a knock at the kitchen door startled her. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened it to find a man standing there, tall, with sharp features and a dark coat that seemed to swallow the light. "Miss Bennet?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. Eliza hesitated. "Yes." "My name is Inspector Harrington," he said, producing a badge. "I'm looking for a man who goes by the name Charles Thorne. I understand you're acquainted." Her heart skipped a beat. Why do you ask, Mr. "Thorne is of interest to me," Harrington replied. "His real name is Edward Whitmore. I believe you've recently discovered this yourself." Eliza's grip on the door tightened. "What do you want with him? That's a matter for Mr. Whitmore and me to discuss," the inspector said evenly. "But I'll be candid with you, Miss Bennet. He's not the man he seems to be." His words sent a chill through her. "What do you mean?" Harrington leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping. "Edward Whitmore may have left his old life behind, but that doesn't erase his past. There are those who believe he owes debts, financial and personal. His disappearance caused more than a few ripples, and some of those ripples have turned into waves." Eliza felt her breath catch. "What kind of debts?" The inspector's gaze was steady. "That's for him to explain, but I advise you to tread carefully, Miss Bennet. A man like Edward Whitmore doesn't leave a life of wealth and power without making enemies." Before she could respond, Harrington tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Bennet. If you see Mr. Thorne, tell him I'll be in the village for a few days. He knows where to find me." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Eliza clutching the doorframe as her thoughts raced. Who was Edward truly? What had he done to warrant such attention? That evening, as twilight settled over the village, Eliza made her way to Edward's estate. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and the dirt path leading to his home felt longer than usual. When she arrived, Edward opened the door almost immediately, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Eliza," he greeted, stepping aside to let her in. "I wasn't expecting you." She stepped into the dimly lit entryway, her resolve hardening. "We need to talk." His smile faded as he led her into the sitting room. The fire crackled weakly, casting shadows across his features. "What's wrong?" "There was a man at the Whitmore estate today," she began. "An inspector. Harrington, he said his name was." Edward's face darkened. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "What did he want?" "He's looking for you," she said softly. "He said you've made enemies, that you owe debts." Edward closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I was afraid of this. So it's true," she pressed. "You left more behind than just a name and a fortune?" He opened his eyes, his expression pained. "Yes, it's true. I made enemies in my old life, Eliza. Not because I was a bad man, but because I made choices that threatened powerful people." "What kind of choices?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward hesitated before answering. "I uncovered corruption among some of the most influential figures in London, businessmen, politicians, even members of the aristocracy. I tried to expose them, but they turned on me. My life became a target. And when my wife died, I realized I couldn't fight them alone. That's when I decided to disappear." Eliza felt a mixture of anger and sadness swell within her. "And you never thought to warn me about this? To tell me that being near you might put me in danger?" He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I never wanted to involve you in this. When we met, I thought I could keep that part of my life buried. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply you bury it." She pulled her hand away, pacing the room. "Edward, this isn't just about you anymore. If people are looking for you, then anyone close to you is at risk, including me." "I know," he said quietly. "And that's why I need to end this. I need to confront Harrington and whoever else comes for me. I can't run anymore." His words gave her pause. Despite her anger, she saw the determination in his eyes, the resolve of a man who had carried his burdens for too long. "I don't know if I can trust you, Edward," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I care about you, and if you truly want to make things right, I'll stand by you. Just no more secrets." He rose from his chair, crossing the room to stand before her. "I promise, Eliza. No more secrets." For the first time since entering the house, she allowed herself to hope that they might find a way forward together. The next day, Edward sent word to Inspector Harrington, requesting a meeting. Eliza, despite her protests, was not allowed to accompany him. Instead, she waited anxiously at the Whitmore estate, her heart heavy with worry. When Edward returned that evening, his face was grave. "It's worse than I thought," he admitted. "What did he say?" Eliza asked, her pulse quickening. "He's not the only one looking for me," Edward said grimly. "The people I exposed years ago, they've learned I'm alive. Harrington believes they'll stop at nothing to silence me." Eliza's blood ran cold. "What can we do?" Edward looked at her, his expression resolute. "We fight back." Edward's declaration, "We fight back," hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Eliza stared at him, torn between admiration for his resolve and fear for what such a fight might mean. "What do you mean, fight back?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with unease. Edward moved to the fireplace, staring into the weak flames as though they held the answer. "For years I've stayed in the shadows, thinking that disappearing would protect me. But the truth is, my silence only let them grow bolder. If I don't confront this now, they'll never stop." Eliza crossed her arms, her worry mounting. "And how do you plan to confront them? These are powerful people, Edward people who have already tried to destroy you once." He turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "I still have the evidence," he said simply. "The documents, the records, everything I uncovered before I left London. It's all here." Eliza's eyes widened. "Here, in this house." He nodded, gesturing toward the hidden room she had discovered. "It's all locked away, hidden behind that bookshelf. The proof of their corruption, their crimes. Harrington knows about it, but he also knows I'll need to take careful steps. If I act too soon, they'll find a way to bury it again or worse, come after you." At the mention of her safety, Eliza's heart tightened. "Then let me help you," she said firmly. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." Edward shook his head, a pained look crossing his face. "You've already done more than I could ask for, Eliza. I can't risk you getting hurt because of me." She stepped closer, her voice rising. "You don't get to make that decision for me. If we're going to face this together, then you need to let me be part of it." Edward hesitated, his hands clenching at his sides. Finally he sighed. "Very well. But we must be cautious. Every move we make has to be calculated." The following days were spent in secretive preparation. Edward and Eliza worked late into the night, poring over the documents he had hidden for years. They uncovered bank statements, forged contracts, and letters implicating some of the most powerful figures in England. The evidence was damning, but it was also dangerous. "I'll need to take this to someone who can act on it," Edward said one evening, spreading out a map on the desk. "Harrington is trustworthy, but he doesn't have the reach to protect this information. I need to find an ally with influence." Eliza leaned over the map, tracing her finger along the path to London. "Do you know someone there?" Edward nodded slowly. "An old friend, Sir Geoffrey Hargrove. He's a member of Parliament and one of the few people I trusted before I disappeared. If anyone can bring this to light, it's him." Eliza's stomach knotted at the thought of Edward travelling back to the city he had fled from. "And what if they find you before you reach him?" Edward glanced at her, a flicker of worry in his eyes. "That's why I need you to stay here, Eliza." "If anything happens, I'm not staying behind," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You said we'd face this together. I won't let you do this alone." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but we'll need to be careful. If they suspect we're carrying evidence, they'll come after us." On a crisp morning, Edward and Eliza set off for London in a modest carriage. Edward had deliberately avoided using his wealth for the journey, keeping their travel as inconspicuous as possible. The documents were hidden in a false bottom beneath Eliza's sewing box, a clever disguise that Edward had devised. As the countryside passed in a blur of autumn colours, Eliza couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey ahead. Edward sat beside her, his posture tense, his eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting danger at any moment. "What will you say to Sir Geoffrey?" she asked, breaking the silence. "I'll tell him everything," Edward replied. "The corruption, the threats, the lengths I went to disappear, and I'll give him the evidence. If anyone can take this to the proper authorities and ensure it's acted upon, it's him. Eliza nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened. Do you trust him? With my life, Edward said simply. The journey to London took several days, and each stop along the way was marked by Edward's growing unease. He instructed Eliza to remain vigilant, warning her to avoid strangers and keep the documents close at all times. It wasn't until the third night, at a quiet inn on the outskirts of the city, that trouble found them. Eliza had just settled into her room when the sound of raised voices echoed from the corridor. She hurried to the door, cracking it open just enough to see Edward standing at the far end, speaking in hushed but urgent tones to a tall man dressed in black. The man's voice rose. You think you can waltz back into London and expose us? You're a fool, Whitmore. Edward's response was calm but firm. I've already exposed you by staying silent. You should have left me alone. The man stepped closer, his posture menacing. You won't make it to Hargrove. We'll make sure of that. Before Eliza could react, Edward turned sharply and caught sight of her peeking through the door. His expression hardened, and he mouthed a single word. Stay. Eliza's heart raced as she closed the door and pressed her back against it. Her mind spun with questions. Who was the man? How had he found them? And what would Edward do now? Moments later, Edward entered the room, his face pale but resolute. We need to leave, now. Eliza grabbed the sewing box, her hands trembling. What happened? They know we're here, Edward said, his voice low. We don't have much time. As they slipped out of the inn and into the cold night, Eliza felt a mixture of fear and determination settle over her. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they couldn't turn back now. The truth was too important to be silenced, and as Edward took her hand, guiding her into the shadows, she realized that their journey was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about survival. The moon hung low in the sky as Edward and Eliza fled into the night, their hurried footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The air was thick with tension, every rustling leaf or distant hoofbeat sending shivers of apprehension down Eliza's spine. Edward held her hand firmly, guiding her away from the inn and deeper into the countryside. "Where are we going?" Eliza whispered, her breath visible in the cool air. "To a safe house," Edward replied, his voice steady but urgent. "An old contact of mine, someone I trust. We'll regroup there before continuing to London." Eliza nodded, clutching the sewing box to her chest. The hidden documents inside felt heavier with every step, the weight of their mission pressing on her shoulders. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at a small, unassuming cottage nestled at the edge of a dense forest. Edward knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times. The door creaked open to reveal a wiry man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. "Edward," the man said, his tone wary but familiar. "You're a sight I didn't think I'd see again." "Thank you for this, Samuel," Edward said, stepping inside and pulling Eliza with him. "We don't have much time." Samuel glanced at Eliza, his gaze lingering on the sewing box. "So it's true, then? You're making your move?" Edward nodded. "They've already found us. We need to get to London before they close in." Samuel gestured for them to sit by the fire, his expression grim. "You're playing a dangerous game, Edward. The people you're up against they don't forgive, and they don't forget." "I'm done running," Edward replied firmly. "If I don't stop them, they'll destroy anyone who stands in their way." Samuel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But brave men often end up in shallow graves." Eliza's stomach twisted at the grim warning, but she refused to let fear take hold. "We have the truth," she said, her voice steady.